Hey everybody, in this video, let's explore why ON1 Photo RAW makes it easier than ever to transform your images with masking. From quick composites using layers, to enhancing portraits, to selective detail in landscapes, masking is a breeze inside of ON1 Photo RAW. Let's jump into 10 masking tips for stunning photographs that you can do quickly and easily. My first masking tip is to use masking to modify the lighting within portraiture. And this could be portraits of wildlife, portraits of people, but it's really helpful in situations like this where you have a lot of backlighting going on and there's not a whole lot of light hitting the face of that subject. So what we're going to do to modify the lighting in the scene is we're going to grab our Super Select AI tool. You can grab that over here in the tool well by just clicking on Super, or we can quickly hit K on our keyboard. With the Super Select AI tool enabled, we can hover over different regions within our scene. You can see it's detected the fox here. We can just select the subject. With the blue overlay, it's indicating to me that that subject is selected. We can then right click and we have all of these different filters as well as local adjustments that we can use to modify that particular region within our image. So I'm going to use an adjustment here and I'm just going to boost the midtones up. So I've boosted up those midtones there. You can see if I turn this adjustment off and on, does a really great job of illuminating our subject and bringing out those details that were much darker before. Now I'm just going to add in a little bit of contrast here to make sure things aren't flat. Maybe boost up the midtones a little bit more there. And I may also go down and I'm going to pull up on my whites just a little bit. Now while I'm doing this, I'm going to hold down the J key on my keyboard just to ensure that I don't have any blown out areas. So around 15 or so looks pretty good right there. And now if I go up to this local adjustment and I turn this off and on, we have much different lighting now within the scene and the face of our subject looks much more illuminated and we can see all of those details. Now remember, with any of these adjustments or filters that you add inside of Photo RAW, you can always modify the opacity if it's too strong and you can tone it down to fit the look that you're going for. So I'll probably pull this back to around 80 or so. Let's also add one last adjustment here. I'm just going to double click to rename this eyes. I'm going to use this more menu, and I really enjoy this magic eye fixer option. I'll enable that, and I'm just going to use my masking brush here to paint in a little bit more light into the eyes of the fox. So now if I turn this off and on, they're much more illuminated and we can see those darker areas a bit better. Might lower the opacity a bit there so that's not so intense. And let's just hit the backslash key on our keyboard. This is the original. And with that lighting adjustment in the eyes and on our subject. My next masking tip is to use masking along with layers to blend one element of a scene into another. So I have this kayak photograph here, and then I have this landscape underneath it within my layers pane there. So we're just going to use our gradient masking tool. We call it the masking bug inside of Photo RAW. And we're just going to eliminate the top half of this kayak photograph, and then we'll blend it into this landscape image here. So I'm going to make sure I have my kayak image selected. And I'm going to head over to my masking tools. They live over here in the left tool well, right there where it says mask. And we're going to make sure we have this button enabled there. That's our masking bug or our gradient mask tool. You can also grab it by hitting M on your keyboard. So with that selected, we're going to make sure that we have our shape here at gradient. That way we can use a gradient to eliminate that top half of our kayak image. So I'm just going to drop this down, and you can see it's already starting to eliminate the top half of that kayak photograph. I'll use this larger handle here to place it right below the ice within the scene. And then I'll use these perforated lines here. I'll lower those down a little bit, and then I'll modify that feathering so that I don't eliminate any of that top half of the kayak. So just like that, quickly and easily, we were able to eliminate the top half of our kayak photograph so that we have a quick quote-unquote composite here with this element blended in with this scene. Now let's grab that kayak photograph here and we'll go into the tone and color section, and we're just going to pull up on our midtones, and we'll bring in a little bit of contrast as well so that the lighting matches up with the lighting in that landscape photograph. Now, one thing you can also do to make this image more believable is you can go into your layers and you can merge these two layers together and then modify that image as a whole. So I'm just going to right click this kayak layer and I'm going to choose new stamped layer. That's going to take these two layers and then merge them together into one complete composite layer there that we can then modify in its entirety. So I'll just rename this complete. And let's go into the effects tab here. Let's add a filter. Let's add some sunshine. We'll just use strong. And then let's also go in and add a filter. And I'll just use a nice subtle vignette with this big softy preset there. Modify the opacity a bit there. And it's looking pretty great. So with these two layers here, we're able to use this landscape image, place this kayak in the foreground, and then we are able to style it a bit by creating a new stamped layer with these two layers there. My next tip for masking is to use color grading along with masking to create duotone or tritone effects within your portraiture. So with this portrait here, it's a little bit underexposed, so let's go into the tone and color section of develop. Let's pull up on the exposure quite a bit so that we can see more of the portrait there. Also pull up on the midtones a little bit. And then I'll give it some contrast just to make sure things aren't flat or dull. So to create that duotone effect here, let's go for a cool feel on the right-hand side where we have this snowy look coming into the scene with these snowflakes. And then we can add a warm feel on the left-hand side, and it can have this sort of juxtaposition between hot and cold. So let's go into the effects tab here. Let's add a filter. And I'm going to add one of my favorite filters for color grading, LUTs. Now the first LUT by default is going to be this blues LUT here, which really brings in a cool feel into the scene. And I really love what it's doing to this right-hand side. But again, we want to have a duotone look within the image, so we need to mask this away from the left. So again, I'm going to use my gradient mask tool or my masking bug. Remember, you can grab that by just hitting M on your keyboard. So I'll drop this down. I can use this smaller handle to rotate it. And I'll just rotate this away from the top, and I'll focus it in on this left-hand side. And I'll probably leave the feathering as is. But with this LUT in there on the right-hand side, it really brings in that cool feel and it complements that snowy look really well. Now to bring in warmth to the left-hand side, let's grab this mask that we just created by going into the masking options, and I'll use this icon right here to copy the mask that we just created. We'll add another filter. We'll add another LUTs filter there. This time we'll go into the More menu, and we're going to use Morning Person, a really warm LUT. But this time we want it on the left-hand side and not the right. So let's go into the masking options. We'll paste that mask that we just created, and then we'll invert it. So really fast, we've created this duotone look with our two color grading filters, our two LUTs. So now what we can do to build upon this look is we can get creative with textures and snow. So let's go into our add filter options here. And in the filters dialog, we have this really handy filter for weather that we can use to incorporate some snow into the scene. So I'll choose weather there. And I'm going to head into this precipitation section. I'm going to go into my texture menu and I'm going to choose catch one on your tongue. With that enabled there, we're bringing in that nice snow effect into that right-hand side of the scene. Now remember, we don't want this applied to the left-hand side. So let's just go into the masking options and we'll just paste that mask that we used for our first LUT. And you can see it's eliminated that from that left-hand side there. Now I don't really want all of that snow on the face of the portrait there. So let's use our masking brush, and I'm just going to brush this away from the majority of her face there. So with our weather now, really adding to that wintry, cool feel. Now let's focus in on this left-hand side and let's bring in a sun flare to warm that section up a bit more. So I'm going to add a filter here. Let's add a sun flare. And let's use this second style here where it just says sun flare. And just like that, it's looking really great there to incorporate that bit of light there to match that warm LUT that we placed underneath it, but it's a little bit too strong on this right-hand side. So again, I'm going to use my gradient mask or my masking bug. I'm going to hit M on my keyboard. Let me just drop this down there. We'll rotate it a bit, and we can remove some of that sun flare from the subject's face and ensure that it's just on this left-hand side near her hair. So if I turn off the sun flare, I'm really enjoying it there. Now remember, you can always lower the opacity if it's a bit too strong, and you can modify the brightness and the saturation of your sun flare in this tone and color section. But I'm just going to leave it as is for now. I may modify it later. But let's continue on here and let's keep modifying the look of this image just to top things off a bit. Now there's just a couple of things that I want to do to complete the edit here. And the first thing is I want to illuminate her face a bit more. So to do that, let's use a local adjustment. I'll add an adjustment here. I'll just rename this Face Brighten. I'm going to select this lighten style there so that I boost the exposure a bit. And let's just use our masking brush to paint some light into her face there. Let's add in one other adjustment here, and we're going to do the same thing we did to that fox portrait, and we're going to illuminate the eyes a bit more. So I'll go into that More menu, and I'll use that Magic Eye Fixer option. Lower the brush size down a bit. We'll just paint some light into her eyes there. Now it's quite intense there, so let's just pull back on the opacity. Typically, I like to pull back on the opacity all the way, and then I can just incrementally pull it up until I get the look that I'm going for. But I'm really enjoying it there. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, Now keep in mind the image is quite underexposed, so it's going to be a very dramatic before and after regardless. But we've started with this, and we brought in some color grading filters, a weather filter, and a sun flare to build this warm and cool duotone feel within the scene. My next masking tip is to use masking to target specific subjects that have a splash of color within them. You can then desaturate the rest of the image and really make that singular color pop. So in this case, we have this red car in front of the Eiffel Tower, but with all of these other colors surrounding that red car, the red sort of gets lost within the scene. So let's desaturate the rest of the image, and we'll leave the red in the car and make that color really stand out. So the first thing we need to do is go into the Effects tab. We'll add a filter. And with this Apply with Mask To menu here, I'm just going to select Transport. In this case, it's the red car. And I'm going to choose black and white. Now, because we've targeted the red car, we're desaturating it. But all we have to do to desaturate the surrounding areas is just head into the masking options, and we'll choose this icon here to invert the mask. That way, we just have the car saturated and the surrounding areas are desaturated. Now, one thing I need to do is remove the saturation from these windows here. So I'm just going to hit B on my keyboard, and I'm just going to brush in this black and white filter into the windows. Now, because it's quite far away from the eye, it doesn't have to be exact and perfect, but you do want to keep it in the lines as much as you can. Now, one pro tip whenever you're masking with the masking brush is to use the bracket keys in your keyboard to modify the brush size. The right bracket key will increase the brush size, and the left bracket key will decrease the brush size. So now we just have that car saturated. I'm going to add a filter here. I'm just going to give this scene a bit of an S curve with my curves filter to add in some contrast and some mood. Let's just modify the opacity a bit so that's not so intense. And if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, I'm really enjoying it. It's really made that red car stand out within the photograph and ensure that it's a prominent subject within the scene. My next tip for masking is to use masking to selectively apply detail into specific subjects within a landscape. So let's do that with this landscape here, but before we do it, let's go into our tone and color. I'm going to use a camera profile, and I'm just going to neutralize the scene again so that we can see some of these darker areas within the photograph better. From there, to selectively apply detail, it's incredibly easy. All we have to do is hit K on the keyboard. We can again pull up our Super Select AI tool, where we can then hover over different regions and select those subjects or objects and apply specific filters or adjustments to them. So let's select the dog, the person, the paddle, canoe. Let's right click and let's add in some dynamic contrast. Dynamic contrast is great for enhancing texture and detail within your scene. Now, just so that we can see the before and after a bit better, I'm going to use Surreal, which is a quite strong preset for dynamic contrast. But if I turn this off and on, those two subjects really start standing out within the image. Now I'll do the same thing again to the grassy regions and also the hilly region in the background. I'll right click, and this time we'll just use Surreal again, but we're going to modify that opacity so that it's not too intense and it doesn't take over So we've used Super Select AI to apply detail into those specific areas. Another filter that I like to use along with dynamic contrast is the glow filter. So let's use a bit of glow in the water and in the sky there. I'll just select those two regions. I'll add in glow, and let's use darker. If we turn this off and on, does a really great job of darkening up that sky and that water, but we may have some harsh edges there within our mask. So let's go to the masking options, and we'll just feather the mask just around 50 or so that we can blend that glow adjustment into the scene. So let's check out our before and after. So that was how to selectively apply detail and also the glow filter into specific areas of your image to make certain areas stand out and make certain areas a bit softer. My next tip for masking is to use masking to create your own custom vignettes inside of Photo RAW. So with this photograph here, let's really focus the viewer's attention in on the wedding shoes here, and we can deter the viewer from noticing any of these other areas on the carpet or the background, things like that. So real quick, I'm just going to hit C on the keyboard. I'm just going to rotate this a little bit to straighten up that back line there. And then from there, let's just go into our local adjustments. I'll add an adjustment, just rename this vignette. And to create our own custom vignette, we're going to grab that masking bug or our gradient mask tool. And this time we're going to use the shape menu to choose center. Now by default, your local adjustments are set to -1 exposure, meaning they're going to darken that region in your image that you mask it into. So when we drop this down here, the center of our mask is going to be protected from the local adjustment, whereas the areas surrounding it are going to get that -1 exposure adjustment. So with this shape here, to modify the size, we can just use this solid line and we can adjust the size of it. We can adjust the shape of it with these solid handles. We can rotate it if we need to. And I'm just going to place it around the shoes there. Now from there, we can feather the mask if we need to. We can make it tighter. But by using this shape here, we can create, again, our own custom vignettes. So if I turn this off and on here, we're really focused in on the shoes now, and we've focused that viewer's attention into that particular section of the image. Now I'm just going to pull back on the exposure a little bit more to get a little bit more dramatic. I'll also add in some contrast, and then I'm going to boost the whites a little bit so that we can see some of this white tint from the gown. Now let's just go into the local adjustments, or rather go into the Develop tab, and we're going to use our tone and color, and I'll just boost the midtones a hair so that we can see a little bit more of our subject. But if we go back to our local tab here and we turn this vignette off and on, it's doing a great job of, again, just focusing the viewer's attention into that particular section of the scene. So from here, once we've created our vignette, we can get onto styling if we need to. And for this particular scene, let's go into the Effects tab, let's add a filter, and let's use a really soft glow. I'll go into the More menu, and let's choose this Orton Clean Glow here. And we can add a nice bit of softness into that region that we're focusing in on. Now because it darkened things up a bit, I'll just go in here and boost those midtones just a little bit more. And just like that, we have our own custom vignette. We have this nice, soft, hazy glow, and it's a nice, dreamy photograph. Let's maybe add one last filter, and let's just use black and white. So let's check out our original and after. And again, keep in mind you can always modify the opacity of any of these filters or adjustments if they're too strong. So let's say the glow is a bit too strong. You can always choose a different one, or you can modify the strength and adjust that opacity there. If the local adjustment is too strong and your vignette is too dark, again, modify that opacity and fine-tune it to fit your particular image. My next masking tip is to use local adjustments and your gradient mask and your masking brush to add in depth to your landscapes. So with this landscape here, this is the original, and it's a great landscape, but it's a little bit bright in the majority of the scene. So what we can do is we can add in contrast into our background and foreground and liven it up a bit. The first thing I want to do is just go into tone and color. I'm going to use my profile here, and I'm going to change it to ON1 landscape. Just going to brighten up the greens quite a bit, boost the midtones, and just liven up the scene with a quick camera profile. I'm also going to add in more contrast here, just in general, with the contrast slider there. So again, this is the original, and this is after. And it's not too bad. Now, it looks great, but I think we could liven it up a bit more, especially in our foreground, using a local adjustment. So let's first start with our sky area though. The sky is nice, but we could make it even nicer with a local adjustment. So I'll go into my local tab here, I'll add an adjustment, and I'll name this Sky Darken. Now again, I'm going to use my masking bug. Remember, you can also hit M on your keyboard. I'm just going to drop that down. I'll use this smaller handle to rotate, and I'm just going to place this within the sky section there. Now, just by default, it's not looking too bad, but it is looking quite dull. So let's lower the exposure a bit more there to bring in those blues. I'm going to add in some contrast. And then this is the key here. Go to your white slider and bring back the whites within those clouds. If I turn this darken off and on now, it does a whole lot to bring back that beautiful blue in the sky while also maintaining the whites within the clouds there. Now let's add an adjustment to our foreground now. I'll name this foreground. And we're going to do a similar task here. We're going to hit M on the keyboard. We're going to drop this down. And we're just going to place this within the foreground section. Do the same thing. We'll add in some contrast, and we'll also boost the whites just a little bit. Maybe pull back on the exposure a hair. Now things are looking a little underexposed now. So what we can do is we can remove some of this local adjustment from specific areas and add in that depth and that contrast. First area here that I want to modify is just this leading line of water. So I'll use my masking brush set to erase, and I'm just going to paint this away from this water section. And we're going to feather the mask later, so you don't have to worry too much about being completely exact. But the more you can stay in the lines, the better. So just like that. And again, I know it doesn't look that great. So what we can do is we can go into the masking options here, and we'll just feather the mask a bit. can see that by feathering the mask, we can remove some of those harsher edges within the scene there and blend in our masking with the scene. Now let's use our masking brush and we can paint away this local adjustment from specific areas within our foreground, and we can incorporate that contrast that we'd liked. And so you can see by removing some of that foreground adjustment, we can emulate the light coming in from the sky there and illuminating our foreground in different areas. Now, depending on your photograph, it may take a bit of time to see what works, but the more you play with it, the better you'll get at it. So from here, let's just lower the opacity a bit to ensure things look exactly the way we want them. And you can see that by having this foreground adjustment, again, we're just giving a little bit of contrast into the foreground there to add in some interest, rather than just having it completely illuminated. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we have our original and then after. So that's how to add depth into your landscapes using your gradient mask and your masking brush. Remember, play around with the contrast within your foregrounds and even in the backgrounds to see what works best for whatever image that you're modifying. My next tip for masking is to use Portrait AI to retouch and to modify the light in specific areas of a portrait. So for this portrait here, let's say we want the eyes a little bit more bright. We want to do just a hair of retouching to remove any blemishes. And we can also use Portrait AI to illuminate the areas within her face to make her stand out within the scene. So we'll go to Portrait here within the Portrait tab. And let's just zoom in so that we can see the portrait modification in action. So let's first perform retouching. We're going to go into the skin section here. And what I typically like to do is just pull up all the way on the retouching slider there. And then I can fine tune these sliders beneath it to fit the portrait. Now there's not many blemishes here, so we probably don't need this incredibly strong. But depending on the portrait that you're modifying and the look that you're going for, you can bring in a lot of that frequency separation retouching to remove any blemishes if you need to. Then we can also modify the detail, so we can make it a little bit more soft, or we can make it more detailed, depending again on the look that we're going for. We can smooth the skin out if we need to. And we can also remove any shine that is brought in from lighting or anything that is adjusting the shine within the scene. So for example, you can see her nose there has a little bit of shine to it, so we can adjust that if we need to. Now below the skin section, we have our face section here. So if we do need to illuminate her face, we can modify that brightness. I may just pull up on it a little bit, around 20 or so. We can also use these different sliders to modify the size of the face and the eye size if we need to. Now I'm not going to modify any of these for this portrait, but I'll just show you these in action here. If you need to slim the face, you can. And if you need to modify the eye size, you can here. Let's move on to the eyes section where we can adjust the brightness and the look of the eyes. So let's bring out a little bit more brightness within the eyes there, just to make them really pop out within the scene. I'll add in a little bit of whitening and just a hair of detail. I'll also remove any dark circles from beneath her eyes with this slider there, and then I'll enhance the eyebrows to give them some detail with that brow enhance slider. In the mouth section, we can modify whitening of the teeth if we have teeth showing within the photograph. We can also adjust the vibrance if we'd like them to be a little bit more saturated. We can modify the brightness and the hue, but I think for this image, I'm just going to pull up on the brightness of the lips a little bit. So if we turn this off and on, it's going to be quite intense. So what you can do is, again, just pull back on the opacity to fit that look that you're going for within your portrait. My next tip for masking is to use SkySwap AI to incorporate a much more interesting sky into your background. So to swap out this sky for a brand new one, we're going to go to this sky tab here. It's automatically going to identify that sky for us. So all we have to do is choose the one that we want to add. So let's go into this sky section here, and we're going to go to category, and there's all of these different categories with dozens and dozens of built-in skies that we can choose from that we can fit into any particular image that we're going for. Now, one of my favorites is this AccuDrone Marshmallow. If we choose that here, you can see even just that first one looks really great within the scene. But we can go into the sky menu here, and we can navigate through and find a sky that we like for that image that we're adjusting. So I think I'm going to go with this one here, this AccuDrone Marshmallow Sky 3. I think that works really great within the scene. And depending on your original photograph, you can modify the look of that sky to fit the image. So for example, if your foreground is quite warm and the sky you've chosen is a little bit cooler, you can adjust that warmth here in this appearance section. You can also adjust the brightness there, which really helps most times at making sure things are believable. And if you have a little bit of fogginess to your original image, you can incorporate a bit of haziness into that sky, again, just to make sure things look believable and natural. One thing I like to do whenever I'm modifying the sky within my scene is I'll go into my effects tab and I'll add a filter or two to gel everything together. So let's add a filter here, and let's just add sunshine, and we'll use strong. Let's just modify the opacity a bit so it's not too intense there. But by adjusting the sky and the foreground at the same time, we can make sure that both the foreground and background sections look natural. So that's how to use masking with SkySwap AI to remove a boring sky and add in. So that's how to use SkySwap AI to incorporate an interesting sky into your background and bring your landscape or any image that has a sky. So that's how to use SkySwap AI to bring your background sky to life by incorporating a much more interesting sky into that section of your image. My next tip for masking is to use masking and local adjustments to illuminate specific sections of cityscapes to make specific buildings or areas stand out. So what we're going to do with this particular image before we get into masking is we're just going to go into the temperature, and I'm just going to cool it down a little bit. I think the cooler feel looks a lot better within the scene rather than that really warm feel. It also adds a bit of drama into the photo. So I've just cooled things down a bit. Now let's go into our local adjustments. I'm going to add an adjustment, and I'll just rename this top, bottom, darken. What we're going to do is we're going to use our masking bug or our gradient mask to darken the top and bottom so that we can focus the viewer's attention into this cityscape. So I'll hit M on my keyboard, and we're going to go up to our shape menu and choose reflected gradient. That way we can have two gradients, one on the top and one on the bottom. So I'll just drop this down here, and you can see immediately, with sort of without even doing anything, we have the viewer's attention focused in on this middle area of our scene. But it does look just a little bit sloppy. So I'm going to pull down on this solid line here so that I don't have too much of that gradient bleeding out above the buildings, and also pull down on this line there so that I can blend in with that water. Now let's go into our local adjustment here. Let's pull up on the contrast. And I'm also going to pull up on the whites just a little bit. Pulling up on the whites is going to blend in this local adjustment into the other areas of the photo. So with the buildings here, what I really want the viewer's attention to focus in on is this middle section here of buildings, where we have the light from the sun illuminating them. So I'm going to add another adjustment here. And I'm just going to ensure that the adjustment is only modifying the contrast within the scene and a little bit of the whites. And then I'm just going to use my masking brush to paint this in on the right and left-hand side. So that the viewer, again, is mainly focused in on this middle area of illuminated buildings. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, the image is feeling much more dramatic and a lot more moody, and again, focuses that viewer's attention into the buildings rather than having the entire scene illuminated. From here, we can style individual sections if we need to. I think adding in a bit of a glow into the water and some sunshine and some detail into the buildings would work really nicely. So let's go into the effects tab. Let's add a filter. I'm going to add glow. I'll use darker. And let's just invert that mask there so that nothing is applied. And then we can again use our masking brush to paint into that water section there and bring in some glow into that foreground section. Let's then add a filter. Let's add dynamic contrast. And with dynamic contrast here, we're going to do the same thing. We'll invert that mask. And then we'll use our masking brush to paint in that detail into that main set of illuminated buildings. From there, let's just copy that mask that we just created. We'll add another filter. Let's add sunshine. We'll use strong. And then we'll place that mask into that particular section there. So if we turn this off and on, we have that sunshine filter and that detail applied to that same area within those buildings. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we're again just illuminating this middle section of buildings here and really trying to focus that viewer's attention into that area where we have the most amount of light in our cityscape. Now things are looking a little bit flat within the scene here, so let's just go into the Develop tab, and I'm just going to add in some contrast. So that's how to target specific areas in a cityscape and focus that viewer's attention into those particular regions.